Welcome to Just Relationships, the show that offers you concrete ways to make your relationships better. Whether it's your boss, your spouse, your children, or your friends, the quality of your relationships in life directly affects how you feel about yourself and the success you achieve. Your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer, a psychotherapist, telecoach, author, and seminar leader, will interview top experts to help you learn to manage this essential part of your life. And now, here's your host, Dr. Duffy Spencer.
Greetings to you. Well, today's show is about love. So Just Relationships offers you a show on love, and more specifically, loving like you mean it, using emotional mindfulness to transform your relationships. And I'm very happy to have as my guest Dr. Ronald Frederick, who is the author of Loving Like You Mean It. So welcome, Dr. Frederick.
It's so nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So tell us what that means, loving like you mean it. Don't people mean it when they declare love for, well, if you're sincere, if you love someone and you even say, I'll love you forever, and you make a vow to love forever and ever, and then people wind up hating each other and divorcing each other, either physically or emotionally. Mm-hmm. And so tell us what you mean.
Loving like you mean it. Loving as a verb, right? Because we can love in our hearts, and then I think really what we're talking about is the actual doing of the relationship, how our commitment and our engagement in our relationship manifests itself. So loving like you mean it, if we were to look at it simply, would be about showing up to our relationships wholeheartedly. That is, meaning being emotionally present as best as we can in a constructive way with our partners. Now that actually is one of the things that many of us find challenging. So we may love in our hearts, but in the actual doing and showing up in that way, that can present difficulties for us.
Oh, yes. And Dr. Frederick, what you say is so true, being emotionally present, constructively, loving wholeheartedly. And yet I think that this is almost like Greek to so many people. What does this mean? Because I'm also a marital therapist as well as being a therapist. I work with individuals as well. And I'm always talking to my clients about being vulnerable. Right. And you actually co-founded the Center for Courageous Living in Beverly Hills, California. Right. And so courage, the courage to be vulnerable.
Exactly. I mean, you raise such an important point. Being vulnerable. And I understand what you're saying, because many of us think, we go about our relationships and think that we're showing up and think that we're being transparent and think that we're communicating, and don't realize that there is actually a whole host of things that are going on under the surface that keep us from being more vulnerable, as you put it. And what does that mean, to be vulnerable? Well, to show the sides of ourselves that our hearts show, and that might be being able to share our fear or our sadness, our needs for the other, in a direct way. And for some of us, being vulnerable might be constructively communicating our anger to our partner.
Yes.
Because that can feel like a scary prospect as well. So when we're in the realm of vulnerability, we're talking about what causes us to work our edge, right? It's a little scary for us to put ourselves out in that way. And that's why, and you point out that's the name of my center in Los Angeles, because I understand that showing up in this way can be scary and does take courage. It takes courage to really be ourselves and to show up in an authentic way in our lives and in our relationships.
Yeah. And what do you think of the shadow? Would you speak to that? Does that make sense?
So when you talk about the shadow, I think you're referencing Jung and maybe the dark sides of us, perhaps.
Yes, the parts that we're ashamed of, we want to hide, we wish we wouldn't have. Just as you're talking about fear, sadness, need. Many adults are taught that they have no right to feel dependent upon anyone.
So you're really getting to an important point, and that is what I bring out in my book, Living Like You Mean It. You just said adults are taught. We learn everything about how to do relationships very early on in our lives. We come into the world extremely dependent on our caregivers, on our parents. If they didn't take care of us, we wouldn't survive. So it's an absolute imperative that we attach, that we connect, and we feel secure in those relationships. And at the same time, our brains are like clay, and they're being molded by these experiences that we're having early on in life. And we're learning all this stuff, and we're learning about what feelings are okay, what feelings are not okay. By okay, I mean what feelings bring our caregivers, our parents, close, and we can feel them with us, and what causes them perhaps to feel uncomfortable, pull away, and that, to an infant, is extremely scary. So these lessons get learned very early on, and they're stored in our implicit brain, which another way you may talk about that is the unconscious. And and it's meant to be that way because the things that are stored in implicit memory are things that we shouldn't have to think about. Like you shouldn't have to think about typing on a keyboard. All that information gets stored in implicit memory, right? Well, the way that we're designed, our relationship software is in our implicit memory. We shouldn't have to think about how to do it. We are supposed to be able to just do it. Well, that's great unless we've had lessons early on in life, or what I would say we have software that doesn't really help us navigate our relationships in a healthy way. So we might talk about the shadow as those feelings and those lessons, the feelings that perhaps make us feel afraid or ashamed or guilty. All those lessons that we learned early on cause us to keep those things inside. And so they live in the shadows, so to speak.
Yes. So in order to be intimate, we have to build some sense of trust. And that's kind of hard to come by in our world. Who is truly trustworthy? And then looking at, well, I don't know if I can ultimately trust anybody in terms of people can have weak times and they can betray us even if they don't want to.
Right.
And then we move into self-trust. And I remember reading so much about Carl Rogers, the whole idea of self-trust and how hard that is to come by. That comes a lot from validation, being validated in your perceptions. And so many of us have not been. We've been actually invalidated.
Right.
So I also like that you talk about compassion and self-compassion. There's so much. Your book is, I will say, it is really very special, Dr. Frederick.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yes,
that is so. I so appreciate hearing that. I really, It's what I'm talking about is very important to me, and I really put a lot of myself and my work into that. So that means so much to me to hear that. What you're talking about, I mean, what I focus on in particular are our emotions. And it's really in our emotions, our emotional experience, that we experience ourselves, that we experience our identity, that we experience who we are, and it's through our experience of our feelings and communicating them and sharing them that we feel connected to others. And when you talk about validation, again, I go back to the very beginning, meaning our early experience in life. Mm-hmm. And if our feelings are valued and validated, doesn't mean everyone has to agree with them. But if they're seen, if they're appreciated, if we're taught to hear them, attune to them, and how to work with them, we gain a sense of trust in ourselves. And we also gain a sense of trust in others, because if in our early experience people are there for us and they honor our feelings, then we kind of expect that that's how it should go, or at least we expect that my relationship should have that sort of experience. Right?
Yes.
So again, if it isn't, so the messages that we get about our emotions, right, affect what it is that we're willing to share.
The lessons we get about our emotions, you're saying.
Right,
yes.
Exactly. And then, so it affects whether we can hear ourselves, and therein lies trust. If we can hear ourselves and we can communicate what is going on for us, and if the other person is able to hear us and appreciate, our feelings, doesn't mean that they have to agree with them.
Absolutely.
But that is where trust is built. And of course, I mean, you mentioned it, we all have moments, we all have lapses. This is not about being perfect. We have arguments, we have disruptions, we have moments where we may not show up for the other person, or they may not show up for us. But the question is, what is crucial is, how do we navigate those moments? Are we able to say, wow, that really hurt, when you weren't there? Or do we go silent? Do we pull away? Do we get passive-aggressive? Do we not say anything and then blow up later? If those ruptures, as we call them, actually get worked through, it makes us stronger. Because we know, okay, there may be a bump, we may have a difficult time, but our bond is strong. We can weather this. We can get through this. That's what loving like you mean it is about, right? But loving like you mean it necessitates us being mindful of our experience and being able to, our emotional experience, and being able to mindfully navigate that with our partners. When we do that, we're loving like we mean it. And when we do that, we're building a strong foundation, and we're strengthening the sense of trust between the two of us.
Yes, this is so layered, Dr. Frederick, and each of your words and sentences are such gems of wisdom, and I want to just stop and pause, because
please do.
Yeah, because we hear the words, they're not terribly, completely unfamiliar, and yet actually practicing them. So I want to just underscore what you talked about in terms of validation. And I say to my clients and students, validation does not equal agreement, just what you said. And people could go, okay, I can buy that. And yet, how often do people invalidate someone they disagree with?
Absolutely.
It's the norm. It's the norm.
We think that, for instance, okay, so an example to hang some meat on this, so to speak, we express our experience. We may say, whatever it is, when that happened, that really bothered me. And the other person says, well, that's not how I see it. That's not how I see it at all. Or that's not, and then we get in an argument about who saw it what way. There's no validation there.
Right.
When we lean forward or someone leans forward and they say, that hurt, and you say, oh, wow, I'm sorry. I can see how you might feel that way. Now, that doesn't mean that, we have to agree. You can say, well, that's not really where I was coming from. Actually, I'm not angry, but maybe feeling more anxious.
Right.
Then the other person's experience isn't invalidated, and there's room for yours as well.
Right. Room.
But when we get in an argument like, well, you shouldn't be angry, or are you kidding? You do the same thing to me.
Yes.
Right? Then we're nowhere near this basic building block, which is respecting that you have an experience and the other person has an experience, and they both need to be seen in order for us to get anywhere else.
Exactly. And here you are, Dr. Frederick, talking about some sophisticated thing like feelings. And actually the other day, or it can be any time, but I said to someone, it's humid. Wow, it's humid. And this person said to me, no, it's not. I swear and this is, and we are looking at weather.
I know.
And
right?
I just kind of laughed to myself and just said not a word. But to me, it was so strange, so bizarre. And this is the kind of thing that people do all the time to each other.
Which is why, you're raising awareness about these things, and which is why I talk about emotional mindfulness. We're just not aware. Unless we had an early experience that we were really attuned to and helped, that helps us be able to do the same. But if we didn't have an experience in that way, we're having an emotional experience or acting in ways that we're not aware of what's happening, which is why emotional mindfulness really is the key that can get us out of these traps that we get stuck in. And that's what Loving Like You Mean It is about. It's about helping the reader, helping all of us become more mindful of what's going on inside of us, mindful in the ways we get triggered by our partner, mindful in the defensive ways we may respond, and then learning how to be with and work with our feelings and communicate them in a mindful way with our partners. That's the way out of this.
That's the way out of it. And it has to do with self-acceptance and being able to kind of give a weather report, like a Duffy report, like a Ron report. This is the world according to me in this moment, and it may shift in the next moment. But right now, this is where I am.
Exactly.
And because all we can be is where we are.
And we can't, fight off our feelings. We have to learn how to work with them.
Right. They just come. Triggers just come. And we can't, I personally have not been able to not be triggered about some things. But then the difference is I have learned to become aware of when I am triggered. And in the words of Richard Schwartz, who founded your familiar internal family systems, that triggers are trailheads. So if I am triggered, it means there's something very rich and deep there that I want to explore.
It's something I talk about them as I talk about being triggered as a signpost, it's guiding us toward where we need to go in order to facilitate our healing.
Right. And just to again, be where we are without judgment, which is, in the language of internal family systems, that's a part, that we have a judge part, and we have a critical part, and we have a fearing part, and we have a bravado part, and all of that. And what do you think about speaking parts language? To say,
I talk about this some in my book. I mean, I think that we're talking about something very similar when we're talking about our emotional experience, and we can talk about it in terms of our feelings. We can talk about being triggered. We can stop, drop, and go inside, as I talk about in my book, and begin to disentangle what's going on inside of us. And all these different experiences, we can think of them as parts of ourselves, and we can also think about the child inside of us. Oftentimes, who is getting triggered is the child inside of us, and what we're really talking about are unprocessed memories and experiences and trauma that we may have had that lives in our emotional brain that hasn't been fully processed. And that's what gets triggered, and that's what affects our perception, and it affects our nervous system and can control our behaviors.
Right. And to not let that child or those inner children or the inner child run the show. And so you talk about stop, drop, and stay.
Yeah.
And then pause and reflect, and then finally to mindfully relate.
Exactly. Those are the 4 steps. Recognize and name when we've been triggered. Stop, drop, and stay. Go inside and work with our feelings. Pause and reflect and get clarity on what it is that's actually going on for us, and think about how best to communicate that, and then to engage in a mindful way, mindfully relate, step 4, with our partners.
Yes, and people can automatically assume that conflict is a bad thing. People are often afraid of anger, and that because many people have had the experience when there's anger, someone gets hurt.
Right.
And so these kind of flare-ups or triggers, I think, can be for the good. As you talk about, you have the rupture, and then you process the rupture, because it may not surface until there is a trigger, a rupture, and then this is where we see the positive side of conflict. If it shows up where the problems are, and then ironing them through, as you say, pausing and reflecting, staying with it, just staying with the feelings, knowing that they're not going to kill you.
Right. Learning how to tolerate being present with what's inside of us and what's going on between us and what's happening for our partners is an absolutely essential skill, because it can feel uncomfortable, it can raise our anxiety, but we can learn how to navigate that. And when we do that, ultimately, the process leads us to a better place where we don't feel that way, and a better place where we feel better between the two of us.
Yes, and you use the language of the triangle and AEDP, the triangle of experience, and the idea that we have the anxiety, and then we have the defenses, and if we can stay at the bottom of the triangle where our true feelings are. Not the adulterated feelings, but the core feelings. Not so many feelings are tinged with judgment. So people will say, "I feel," and then they proceed to give a judgment.
Yeah. Well, those secondary feelings are sort of what we learned. We learned that it was scary, that it was dangerous in some way to show, whether it's our sadness or our fear or even our happiness, that something bad is going to happen. And so the triangle helps to separate all of that out. So I talk about it in the book. It's a tool that you use. So you can separate out your anxiety and your discomfort and your judgment from what's actually underneath, which is the feeling that really needs our attention, our core feelings.
core feelings and our basic needs. And again, I just want to say again, as you said earlier about the need for someone, how we've been taught that we're not supposed to need someone whom we love, and that's ridiculous.
Well, it actually goes against the way that we're wired, because if you think about it, and what we know from attachment theory, we're born into the world, and we wouldn't survive if we weren't together.
Exactly.
That's why we attach. And as Bowlby talked about it, that need for attachment lasts our whole lives.
Right.
And so it's about healthy dependence, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And within which there can be interdependence and independence. But having needs, absolutely, for connection is just an innate human need. We're wired that way. So we may get messages about it and be told that it's not okay, but it's just, flies in the face of what we understand as being, just human nature.
Just human nature. And instead of all the shoulding on people, how you should feel, you shouldn't need anybody.
Right.
You should be independent, and you shouldn't care if someone rejects you or shows disapproval. You're an adult. You shouldn't care. So what can a person say to themselves about something like that?
Well, again, you mentioned compassion,
mm-hmm.
and I want to remind or say to anyone who has those feelings come up that, first of all, exactly what I said about, these are human needs. Having our feelings, we're wired to feel. If we're rejected, if we're hurt, we're wired to have a response to that. And you can either work against it or you can work with it. And we need to be able to work with it in order to be able to take care of ourselves. But one of the things an exercise that I have in the book... Oh,
please, Dr. Frederick, tell us next time. Everyone, you will be so pleased to know that Dr. Frederick is coming back next week for part 2 of Loving Like You Mean It, using emotional mindfulness to transform your relationship. Ronald Frederick, Frederick. You can get it in the online and in bookstores. Loving Like You Mean It, Dr. Ronald Frederick. And thank you so much. And this is Dr. Duffy Spencer saying goodbye for now and wishing you great relationships.